Hi, we continue today in 1 Samuel 13 and complete the chapter, as our various writers, or the final editor, whoever's responsible for our scene, increased the suspense greatly by delaying the actual battle between the Philistines and Saul's army until the next chapter. And so, although we saw at the very beginning of the chapter in the first verses, a couple of videos ago, Jonathan poking the Philistine bear by making an almost completely unaccompanied raid on them, and we saw after that the Philistines mustered their chariots and their army such that they were as many as the sand on the seashore. Then Samuel confronted Saul, ignoring the military threat, but now we turn to the focus of the military situation. And not only are Saul and his people outnumbered, they're completely outweaponed, so to speak, as we'll see in this section. Another thing about this section that's interesting is there are many Hebrew words and places that are only here, leading some scholars to think that this is an insertion from some later time or from some different author, and that might perhaps be the case. But it fits here well, again, in the terms of the plot of extending the recognition that the Israelites have no real chance against the Philistines without Yahweh's help. There's no rational way an army of 600 could defeat these countless Philistines with their 3,000 chariots, and as we're going to see, their sharpened swords and spears. So let's jump right into it here as we go. We're looking today at this black section here, the end of chapter 13. And I'm going to bring the atlas up because this is all about places here, and some of the places aren't going to be on the map. We'll also look at Google Maps to see something about the actual location as best as we can guess what it is to fit the pieces together here. So one of the themes that we're going to see as a key word in this section is the Hebrew seen here as present with mitz in the nifal, meaning to be found. And I just want to bring that up right away so we can highlight how the writer here is contrasting what's found and what's not found. So there's 600 people found with Saul, and then the people who were found with Saul and Jonathan stayed in Geba, which will matter a little bit. But there's no smith to be found throughout all the land of Israel because the Philistines control metallurgy. And so on the day of battle, neither sword nor spear was to be found in the possession of any of the people to be found with Saul and Jonathan. And that double use there is completely covered over by the new RSV, as it is in many translations. But plainly, by putting it twice in there, it's contrasting the fact that Saul and Jonathan have some people, but they have no weapons. And so what good is an army going up against chariots and swords and spears with no comparable weapons? We'll see it doesn't matter for David because he's got his slingshot and his 5 stones, but that's a story for another day. So let's return to our atlas here and focus on what the text tells us. So Saul, his son Jonathan, this is the first time we're hearing that Jonathan is his son, and we're going to be told that again a little later in this chapter. So now we know the one who initiated the raid was Saul's own son, and the contrast with Saul and his son, of course, is with both Samuel and his absent sons, and before that Eli and his sons, and eventually it'll be with David and his sons. Jonathan will not be Saul's successor. In fact, he'll be David's best friend, and the seeds of the dispute will be in chapter 14, but we see their relationship here working relatively closely together. So Saul, his son Jonathan, the people who were found with them, stayed in Geba of Benjamin, so that's right here, but the Philistines encamped at Michmash here. And to highlight what's going on here, let's look at Google Maps so we can see something up close. So to get a relative situation, here's where Jericho was, and here's Jerusalem. And if we zoom in, we can see some of the similar things, although it's not clear whether the places named this are actually the same places that were in biblical times. So here's Geba, as in Geba, Benjamin. And here's Mukamas, which is understood as a village, which is where Michmash was. And here's another place with the name Michmash on it, as you can see there. When we look at and there's Jericho over to the east. When we zoom in on this area, though, one of the questions is, where is this battle taking place? Because it's described as down here, the mountain that looks down upon the valley. And there aren't any apparent immediate mountains in this area. When we shape the map like this, you can see it's hilly, but there's certainly no Mount Hermon, 9,000 foot plus mountain on the edge of Lebanon there. There is this Rift Valley down here, as is not surprising in a land like this. Whether that's where the battle is supposed to take place, it's hard to say. But we see the kind of terrain there that is not necessarily visible from our line-drawn map here. So There they are, the Philistines at Michmash, and Jonathan and his son and the people that we found with them at Geba, right there together. And recall the Philistines had a garrison down here too. So this is where their outpost is, and they're very close together. This is just a few miles apart. And raiders, it said, but raiders is a bad thing here. It's a verb actually in a participle, those destroying. The word is used as destroy later in Samuel. 1 Samuel, you can hear as ravage earlier, and again as raiders here. But the destroyers, more explicit than raiders, those coming out to destroy, came out of the camp of the Philistines in 3 companies, just as Saul did against the Ammonites. I doubt that we're supposed to understand the Philistines are imitating Saul, because they're, of course, the superior, well-trained and experienced warriors. But that splitting into 3 companies is a similar strategy. And yet they seem to go in odd places. Since Saul and his people are here, why would they send one toward Ophrah, to the land of Shual, which isn't known, but obviously to the northeast up here, another toward Beth Horon here to the west, and another turned toward the mountain that looks down upon the valley of Zebulun toward the wilderness. Literally, valley of Zebulun means valley of hyenas, but it's not clear exactly where that is. Wilderness is actually a rare word in this part of 1 Samuel, but it's only used one time earlier, echoing explicitly the sojourn out of Egypt. Later, it'll become a place that David hides from Saul, so like the Israelites hiding from the Egyptians at the beginning of their journey. So first time we're hearing wilderness in this scene. And then this section here, I want to bring up this whole section so we can see from 19 to 21 is seemingly a narrative parenthetical, and there are many words in here that are unique here. And that's why here at verse 19 I have notes from scholars who suggest it's from another source. But I want to bring up this quote from Marvin Chaney, who is a long-standing social political reader of the Hebrew Bible. And he notes this important strategic point. Had the Philistines wished only military and political domination, their simplest course would have been an attempt to withdraw and withhold all metals from Israel. They in fact adopted the more complicated and difficult option of seeking to deny the Israelites their own smiths, capable of producing metal weapons, while allowing the peasants of Israel the metal tools without which they could not produce the agricultural surpluses, quotes on surpluses there, that the Philistine tyrants hoped to milk from the hill country. In other words, the whole point of having a war, or having a king in the first place to lead your war, is the threat of the Philistine chariots with their iron wheels that can go up the terraced hillsides and take the Israelite agriculture that the Israelites need both for food and for trade. And so they can't destroy the Israelites' agriculture. That would be putting, the cow that they want to milk out of the pasture. So they have to do the tricky thing, as Chaney points out, of allowing them, as we see further down, to have farm implements here and plowshares, mattocks, and axes, but not to have swords or spears. No smith to be found throughout the land, an aspect of not to be found. So that word is used elsewhere for smith. It often is translated as engraver, including the word for carpenter would be like an engraver of trees, which is an interesting way to put it, but a craftsperson of metal in this case. To be found, and this is not the common phrase later, Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, but Gavul, the boundary of Israel. So not that same sense of the land as the agricultural habitat that people produce plenty in. There are vines and fig trees, as we hear in a couple of passages in Isaiah and elsewhere. So no smith to be found, for the Philistines said, and it's not clear how we know this, how the author knows this. Presumably it's the propaganda network or a rumor mill that's spreading the word out there. And again, the third time now that we're hearing Hebrew. So this again from the perspective of the Philistines. So we heard it earlier from the perspective of Saul, we heard it from the narrator, and now we're hearing it from the Philistines, which is the common way we hear Hebrews, in the mouths of enemies, Philistines and Egyptians. And again, we've looked at Meyer Sternberg's book, Hebrews Between Cultures, about that, and we'll look more at that when we see chapter 14. But Sternberg makes a point of highlighting that these are not the same as the Israelites, although to the Philistines perhaps they are. We saw there was a split earlier between Hebrews who cross the river to the land of Gad and beyond, and the Israelites who stayed with Saul and Jonathan. So whether the Philistines can't make the distinction or not is something we'll look at later. So they must not make swords or spears for themselves. In other words, the flip side of what we see in Isaiah and Micah of beating swords into plowshares, they can not beat their plowshares into swords. Admonition that the prophet Joel raises in a time of war. So all the Israelites went down to the Philistines to sharpen their plowshares, mattocks, axes, or sickles. Curiously, this is the only time that the word for plowshare is used here. A different word is used in Isaiah and Micah, the classic swords into plowshares passages. And similarly, these other words for axes and sickles are very rare words. Similarly, this description of the cost is very rare, and it's an incredible amount of detail. Why do readers need to know exactly what the charge was? And even then, it's vague in the Hebrew, as we'll see in just a second. So it says here, the charge, again, a word only used here. Baruch Halpern notes that, though, that it's evidence for the text's pre-exilic provenance as it is confirmed in archaeological evidence, the use of that word, against scholars who want to say that all these rare words indicate a much later text from time not with the common language that we see otherwise in 1 Samuel and much of the Hebrew Bible. So I won't look at all the details of the Hebrew, but all these words are unusual. The normal Hebrew word for shekel is shekel, and the word here is phim, only here. So it's an unusual situation. So they can pay the Philistines to sharpen their farm implements, but they can't have any swords or spears. So what kind of battle is it going to be when they have no swords and spears? They don't have any chariots. We have no reason to believe their soldiers are trained like the Philistines, with certainly battle-hardened soldiers. And our section comes to an almost conclusion here. So on the day of the battle, neither sword nor spear was to be found in the possession of any of the peoples, to be found with Saul and Jonathan. But Saul and his son Jonathan had them. Well, just the two of them, huh? That's not going to do much against the Philistines, is it? And our passage closes here with a garrison of the Philistines, or outpost, a different word than we saw earlier in 13:3. That was a much wider word that could mean a fort or an outpost or part of a building. Here's a more traditional word for an outpost, and it'll be a key word in chapter 14, as we'll see. The Philistines had gone out to the pass of Michmash here, so Ma'abar here used in this scene, and we see Michmash here, but we don't know exactly where the pass is. But that description highlights that it's going to be a battle that takes place sneaking behind mountains and trying to appear from one side or the other, as opposed to an open plain. And so we've gone this whole chapter 13 with the battle set up and a great tension set up over what would happen, and the odds look greatly against Saul and Jonathan, and we'll see what happens in chapter 14. See you then. Bye-bye.